Okay, so I do performance studies, and I notice that everybody is very far away. I have my eyes on you. First, thanks to Professor Kleinberg for this opportunity to participate in this seminar and to come to Israel, where I see the other Israel outside of Jerusalem, and to Elia Aitken for taking care of the logistics of my stay. The second part of this, The second part of this talk comes from my forthcoming work on the agency of materiality. So if anybody's interested in that topic, it's like a Q&A, we can do that. Today I'm going to juxtapose two classes of South Indian females who are characterized as moving. The Indian language word is chanchal. More specifically, females who move too much, and thus are on the boundaries of contemporary middle-class gender norms in India. First, we'll focus on a class of women called matamas, who have entered a particular ritual relationship with South Indian village goddesses that frees them from marriage to human males. And then we'll move to a discussion of the goddesses themselves. The goddesses are not only moving, but they are excessive, how I translate the Indian language word ugra. They're excessive in their strength and desires, so excessive that most householders can't keep her in their domestic shrines. Her demands are too much for them to sustain on a daily basis. However, matamas are able to bear them. Both women and goddesses are increasingly being held in place by a growing dominance of upper caste and middle class gender norms and aesthetics. And these constraints have changed or are in the process of changing their identities and selfhoods. There's a lot of ethnography in what follows, and I had to leave a lot out to make it within, it'll be about 50 minutes, so I hope it's clear enough. Let me take a moment to explicate the term chanchal. The word literally means moving. Both darting eyes and a frisky horse can be chanchal. The Hindu river goddess Ganga, flowing movements, is described as chanchal. So too is the goddess of wealth, Lakshmi Chanchal, whose comings and goings can be rather sudden and who can't be counted on to stay in place. Little girls or toddlers who move a lot can also lovingly be called chanchal. When I took my daughter to India when she was 1.5 years old, several of my Indian friends commented that she was chanchal, just like her mother. I too moved around a lot as an ethnographer, more than an Indian female university professor would. But there comes an age when the word is attributed to girls and women as a negative valuation. A chanchal woman is unstable, fickle, unsteady in mind. It may be implied that she's sexually available or too flirtatious. Even swinging one's braids around too much can lead a schoolgirl to be called chanchal. A chanchal woman not only moves, as of course all women do, rather she moves too much and in places proper women shouldn't be, that is public space. I've never heard a male being called chanchal, although every generalization in India has its exceptions. So for those of you who know India, please tell me. Moving or chanchal women are threatening to both middle class and upper caste patriarchal social structures. Velcheru Narayana Rao has argued that women of South Indian non-landowning castes, such as artisan and herding castes in particular, are free to move out of their home more often than women of landowning castes. He argues that the latter protect their women, quote unquote, to keep them in place in the same way they protect their land. On a practical level, these landowning families are not traditionally dependent on outside income of their women. In contrast, lower caste and lower class women are often compelled to work outside the home, in the fields, in construction, or road work. As lower class families move into the middle class, or aspire to do so, and women become more educated, their physical movement outside the house is often curtailed. I remember a case during my dissertation fieldwork in the Dark Ages, 1980, when I had joined a group of tribal Gond women to go out on a harvest dance. That is, the dance transforms the rice paddy into the goddess Lakshmi herself. We passed by a house where a 16-year-old girl was leaning against the doorway, and her dancing friends called her to join the group. And her immediate response was, "No, I can't, now that I'm 10th grade educated. My brothers say I can't go out." Education at this level is physically constrictive. Of course, as women become educated enough to find employment that depends on their leaving the home, banking, teaching, doctoring, IT work, etc., they do move into the public sphere. But there is still a sense that they should, quote, go and come, and not wander or linger on the way. Public space is male space. For the goddess, the story is a little different. Village goddesses traditionally live in open-air sites from which they are said to wander. Today, they are often physically being held in place with permanent walled and roofed structures, both because of the worshippers' devotional motivations — they should have the same convenience as we do, said one worshipper — and motivations to quite literally protect the goddesses from urban development and the crazy traffic that has grown up around them. Today, I'm going to bring together Matamas and village goddesses as cases of chanchal females being held in place. Although the motivations for restricting their movement may begin quite differently, the results are similar. To hold them in place is to change their identity and selfhood, from independent women to protected women, protected both by marriage and by architectural enclosures. So first we'll consider the chanchal women called Matamas. Matamas are women who have been offered to Grama Devatas, or village goddesses. Yeah, there are only this many words you have to learn. Anyways, they're offered to a Grama Devata as babies or little girls when they or their village have experienced an illness associated with the goddess herself. Grama Devatas both protect from and also manifest as illnesses such as poxes and childhood fevers associated with the hot season. The assumption is that offering a girl to the service of the goddess will please her and she'll withdraw her manifestation as illness. Note, lower caste Matamas carry the burden of protecting the entire community. When these girls reach puberty, their families celebrate a wedding-like ritual in which the girls and goddesses exchange thalis, or wedding pendants, one with the other. This relationship both protects the girls and places them under obligation to follow the goddess's commands, often in ritual roles. Matamas were traditionally seen to be ritually auspicious women because they are never widowed. Forgot. Sorry, the color is really quite good, but in any case. Anyways, they're auspicious women because they are never widowed, since they exchange thalis with a deity who never dies. Their blessings of households across castes avert inauspiciousness. Many Matamas continue to serve the community in ritual roles during the annual festival of the goddess and throughout the year through possession, during which the goddess speaks to clients who have special needs or illness. One Matama told me she was compelled by the goddess to keep moving. Quote, "When I was 12, presumably after reaching puberty, the goddess took me all around the world. She didn't allow me to stay in one place. Even now, I keep moving. The goddess keeps taking me from hill to hill, valley to valley, village to village. I go wherever she calls me. Wherever I go, she doesn't allow me to stay for more than 10 days. Get up," she says, and she brings me back, and I keep going around from village to village. Matamas are then literally moving women across physical space outside the home. But they are also socially chanchal. As mentioned earlier, they do not traditionally get married to human males, although they may have sexual relationships with them and most have children. Today, there is a societal ambivalence about these, quote, non-wives, created in part by the perceived threat of a woman not tied down by marriage, who moves across and thereby challenges traditional upper caste and upper class social and gendered norms. In contemporary South India, outsiders to their communities often refer to Matamas as loose women or prostitutes. The tradition of offering girls to temples or deities was first outlawed by the British in an effort to, quote, protect them in 1934, and these traditions continue to be illegal under Indian law. Nevertheless, some girls still are offered to the goddess underneath and outside the purview of the law. Although illegal, I argue that the traditions have been threatened as much by an increasingly dominant middle-class gender and sexual norms as by the law. Matamas are no longer respected as being auspicious. Respectable women, middle-class women, are not chanchal. They do not wander in public space and are traditionally tied down in marriage to men. These are generalizations about the tradition, so I'm just going to give you a few stories from two women whom I met who are rather unusual matamas in that they did marry human males, and perhaps this is why they were willing to talk to me in public. They had socially sanctioned marital status. I first met Veshalama during the festival of Navratri, or the 9 Nights of the Goddess, at the goddess Gangama's largest temple in Tirupati, South India, where I was living for a year-long research project with that Grama Devata. It was early in my research and I hadn't yet heard about matamas. It truly is an underground tradition. But I noticed right away the confidence with which Veshalama moved around the temple, the fact that she came to the temple alone, not something common for most women, and she spent longer periods of time there than other women. She could often seem to be performing temple housekeeping tasks such as sweeping the courtyard. Towards the end of the festival, I began to talk with her, and she told me that she walked about a half an hour to and from the temple each day, that she got restless sitting at home. Restless is another valence of chanchal. And that sometimes when she was feeling particularly sad, she'd spend the night sleeping under the temple gateway or gopuram. Veshalama invited me to visit her home. That morning, after serving me tea, she offered to take me on a walking tour of Grama Devata shrines in the vicinity and then to several forest shrines on the outskirts of Tirupati. We walked for several hours. Although 7 months pregnant, she walked quickly and confidently at a very different gait than the middle-class women I know, an enactment of her freedom and compulsion to move. When I first asked the temple flower sellers whether Veshalama had affiliation with the temple, they simply said no, but they were evasive. I noticed knowing looks and some whispering. When several months later I had learned about the tradition of matamas, I understood these whisperings and asked the flower sellers directly, is she a matama? Yes, they confirmed, but with little elaboration. While others may have only whispered about this identity, Veshalama herself was not ashamed of her Tali relationship with the goddess when I asked her if I could record a bit about her life history. By that point, I knew she was married to a man, and therefore her story would not be, quote, typical. Seated in the temple courtyard, as soon as I pulled out my voice recorder, we were immediately surrounded by a group of curious onlookers. And I suggested to Veshalama, maybe we move under that tree at the periphery. But she boldly asserted, whatever I have to say is by the grace of the goddess. I'll speak right here. And she began. My life has been nothing but trouble. I've experienced only troubles, troubles, and troubles. Veshalama was adopted as a baby by relatives when her mother died. She said her trouble started even then. Her relatives always called her adopted and didn't treat her as a true daughter. Then she told the story of contracting measles or some other kind of pox when she was a little girl, at which time her adoptive parents offered her to the goddess. And when she reached puberty, they tied her wedding pendant to me and mine to her, she said. They married her to the goddess. Although matamas do not traditionally marry men, her relatives soon arranged a marriage with an old man in an effort to, quote, get rid of her. Veshalama resisted this marriage and chose her own husband, for which her adoptive mother cursed her and cut off all relationships. Veshalama attributed many of her subsequent troubles to breaking the convention of a matama staying unmarried. Her husband began to abuse her soon after she gave birth to a daughter instead of a son. But he also feared her because of her relationship with the goddess. Once after he'd beaten his wife, Veshalama said the goddess came to her husband and warned him, if you hurt her, I will kill you. If she as much cries, I won't allow you to live anymore. At some point, Veshalama's husband briefly left her, but her brothers wouldn't let her move back to her natal home. We don't have any connection with you anymore, so leave, they said. We didn't give birth to you, so leave. They wouldn't accept her presence even when she attempted to attend her father's death rituals, abusively asserting that they wouldn't perform the last rites if, quote, this prostitute is here. Note that the brothers have internalized a dominant cultural view that matamas are merely prostitutes. They refused to perform their father's cremation with her present, and Veshalama recounted she sold her little gold earrings to raise funds to perform the cremation, which she did in the middle of the night. Throughout these troubles of harassment, abuse, and rejection, Veshalama said the goddess provided her refuge. I have no one, she said. If I want to go to my natal home, no one is there for me. I have no one. Whenever I feel sad, I come to the temple and I stay here. She, the goddess, is my mother and my father, and my mother-in-law too. The temple is a literal refuge from her abusive husband at times, where she says no one asks why she is there and no one bothers her. She comes and goes at will. Another Mahatma married to a male, Pujarama, is different than Veshalama in that she has a routinized ritual practice in which patients come to her for a problem. She becomes possessed by the goddess, who then delivers a solution or ritual prescription. I was introduced to Pujarama by the male organizer of the Grama Devata Gangama's annual festival in a village on the outskirts of Tirupati. Although I had immediately recognized her strong personality and knew she was a ritual specialist, I had not noticed her freedom of spatial movement since I had met her in domestic contexts, nor did I recognize she was a widow, since she still wore the vermilion forehead marking and wedding pendant that I had earlier associated with married women. When I registered my surprise that she was a widow, she answered, 101 Gangamas, or goddesses, gave me my forehead marking. Why should I take them off when my husband dies? Only then did I recognize her to be a Mahatma. When I first visited her at home, Pujarama immediately launched into the narrative she correctly thought I had come to hear. She recounted that even as a little girl, she was attached to the goddess. From my childhood, she said, I used to play with the goddess. I made her out of clay and played with her, and she came over me, suggesting possession. That was when I was young, about 12 years old. That is, the goddess began to possess her at around puberty. Then she said, I thought I shouldn't work as a prostitute, that I shouldn't go with a man like that. This statement implies her relationship with the goddess created expectations that she would not marry a man, but that she could have sexual relationships with several men. But she rejected this expectation. At the same time, the goddess came to her soon-to-be husband and told him he should move to Tirupati, where she said, quote, I'll get you married to a very devout girl. Pujarama insisted that she didn't want to get married to a man, but that the goddess married me off, and then the children came. Later in her narration, Pujarama went back to her youth. When I was 12, the goddess took me all around the world. She didn't allow me to stay in one place. Even now I keep moving. Even now she makes me go to old temples, to powerful goddess stones. Wherever people are having problems, she takes me there. And then she repeated, the goddess keeps taking me from hill to hill, valley to valley, village to village. I don't know when she'll stop me and where she'll allow me to build my own house and what she will do. One way Pujarama continues to move spatially is to go from temple to temple as a ritually auspicious woman, bringing the goddess's blessings, particularly to run-down temples. Interestingly, Pujarama performed the actual tali, or wedding pendant, exchanged with the goddess only after she was married and after her 3 children were born, rather than traditionally as they do, reaching puberty. She recounts, 101 Amavarus, or goddesses, came to me. They took me to the Gangama temple. They bathed me, applied vermilion and turmeric, auspicious substances associated both with the goddess and married women. They put bangles on me. They told me, all these days you were with your husband. Now you're our own. Wherever we are, you should come there. I haven't removed my forehead marking in vermilion, even though my husband is dead, because 101 goddesses put them on. I haven't taken them off. The goddess tied my tali. Now if the goddess comes on me and speaks, everything she says will happen. Pujarama's intimate relationship with the goddess manifests itself in her matted hair, that's her to the right, a sharp contrast to the carefully oiled and braided hair, or put up in a bun, of middle-class women. She says, this happens by itself. However many times I keep braiding my hair, in the night something happens, and in the morning the hair has grown like this, becomes matted. I keep shaving my head, and it keeps growing again. And the goddess asks me, why are you shaving your head? And I tell her, because I get lice. That's why I shave my hair. Both of us argue, and me. Pujarama invariably loses the argument. But her matted hair gives her ritual authority, as it is interpreted by those who come to consult with her as a manifestation of the goddess herself. Anthropologist Lucinda Ramberg writes of a government campaign in the neighboring state of Karnataka in which, quote, reformers cut the matted hair of Matamas and handed out packets of shampoo as a step towards reforming the, quote, illicit sexuality of these women. That is, unruly hair is equated to unruly sexuality outside the confines of marriage. Pujadama's singular complaint when I met her was that because the goddess compelled her to keep moving, she had no permanent home, no owned property, just as the goddess herself traditionally does not have a permanent structure. She keeps moving from rental property to rental property. She says, you must be born for this in order to bear her. Most people can't even keep pictures of her in their house. Let's see if they can. They'll get scared of her power and take her images back to the temple. I was born for this, and I faced all these difficulties without a house, without any stable home place or uru. I wander around from village to village, between tree and snake hole. If it was anyone else, they would have left the goddess and gone off. But because I was born for this, even after having faced all these problems, I'm not worried that I don't have a house, that I don't have this, that I don't have that. Whatever will happen, let it happen. Why should I have what the goddess herself does not? Nevertheless, she later said she was waiting for her circumstance to change. Someday, she hoped, the goddess would let her stay in place, her own place. Both Veshalama and Pujadama occupy a marginal social space. One is an abused, rejected woman without extended family, and the other a widow. Their relationships with the goddess have provided them a space of social refuge and ritual agency in the public sphere. The relationship also gives them confidence and an identity independent of their husbands. However, both of their narratives suggest that their Tali relationships and the protection of the goddess have not translated into trouble-free lives. They are compelled by the goddess to move and wander, often in places a middle-class woman would not find herself, which leaves them vulnerable to social ostracism and middle-class judgment from which even the goddess herself has not been able to protect them. Just one sec. To change the marital status of Matamas is key to efforts to keep them socially in place, which may also mean keeping them physically in place. There are several NGOs in Tirupati who are working to, quote, rehabilitate the Matamas and their children. And their first focus has been to get the women married, as they say, to the men with whom they are having, often long-term and monogamous, but not always, sexual relationships. That is, they are putting pressure on these Chancho women to stay in place in a socially acceptable marital relationship. The Tirupati village goddess Gangama too has been given a husband. When we first met her in 1992 and noticed that she was wearing a wedding pendant, I asked the temple flower sellers who her husband was, again before I knew anything about Matamas. The flower sellers were initially puzzled by my question, but eventually answered there was no husband. After all, one of Gangama's primary myths tells the story of a landlord attempting to force her as a pubescent girl into marriage, to which she initially complied. But during the wedding ritual of rounding the sacred fire 7 times, she turned around and grew from earth to sky, showing her true, fearsome divine self. The groom ran for his life. Gangama pursued him for 7 days, ultimately catching and beheading him. Aggressive masculinity was killed. When I asked Veshalama the same question early in our relationship, who was Gangama's husband who gave her a tali, she emphatically declared there was no husband. It's a vow people make, that if they get married or have children or something good happens to them, they'll give her a tali or wedding pendant. It doesn't mean she got married. Who would be able to bear her by getting married to her? Even my own husband keeps telling me that after getting married to me as someone in a tali relationship. He's not able to bear me. When I returned to Tirupati for long-term research in 1999, only 7 years later, and asked the same question again to the flower sellers, they immediately identified Shiva as her husband. Although there's no mythology linking Gangama and Shiva, and he remains absent both iconographically and ritually, the idea of a husband is a way of bringing Gangama into a more Brahminic and middle-class worldview in which women are or should be held in place by marriage. We now shift to other ways traditionally Chanchal Grama Devatas are being kept in place through transformation of their dwelling places from open-air shrines to enclosed temples. Traditionally, Grama Devatas have not been enclosed within permanent structures, but rather in the form of rock heads, uncarved rocks, or tridents. They live in the open air at village boundaries or crossroads, sites from which they are said to be free to wander. There are numerous stories about failed attempts to build a temple around one or another of these goddesses. Roofs fall in, walls crack, etc., until the efforts are abandoned. One Grama Devata female shrine attendant told me, they don't stay in place at night, they wander. For example, this goddess in this shrine wanders in our neighborhood like a security guard. However, many of these goddesses have been successfully enclosed in permanent structures that stay standing. And architectural changes often lead to changes in temple personnel, from lower caste women to Brahmin men, and changes in ritual from animal sacrifice to Brahminic homum. And even the named identities of some of these goddesses are changing. The process of stabilizing Grama Devatas fell out of my waistband, we'll just put it there. The process of stabilizing Grama Devatas architecturally is a gradual one. As villages, towns, and cities extend their habitation to encompass boundary Grama Devatas, they may have their images lifted onto cement platforms built around them, and gradually walls and roofs have been added to some of the structures. Courtyards are walled in, and the goddess is sometimes given a new full-body anthropomorphic image instead of just a head. The aesthetics of the goddess's ornaments and clothing, too, have changed. In some temples, from the turmeric masking characteristic of Grama Devatas, to a silver mask, from cotton saris to silk ones, from village ornaments to middle-class ornaments. The process of the transformation of the largest Gangama temple in Tirupati followed this general pattern. According to the current patriarch of the mid-level caste family that was serving the goddess when I first met her in the 1990s, she began as a stone head, like the one to your left, in an uninhabited jungle, to which only irregular offerings were made. The patriarch's father and his family were making pilgrimage from Madras, now Chennai, around 1913 to the great god Venkateshwara in Tirupati, when he noticed a fallen over stone head in the jungle outside the town. He asked an elderly man standing nearby who this was, and the man answered, "She's the true mother, the goddess, Satyamanatali." The grandfather thought such a great goddess shouldn't be left just like that, out in the open, and he built an enclosure. Some local landlords objected to a permanent structure for the Grama Devata, knowing of her predilections for open space and fearing her anger. So the grandfather sought out the opinion of the goddess directly. In a common mode of asking a deity for an opinion, he put a neem branch on her head and told her to drop the branch if she accepted the enclosure. After waiting several hours, Gangama gave her approval, and the branch dropped to the ground. The family never returned to Madras, but stayed in Tirupati to serve this powerful goddess, Gangama. Over the years, the family continued to make small improvements to the temple structure. And as the temple grew, its architecture transformed, and Gangama's annual festival began to draw larger and larger crowds. The temple caught the eye of the Temple Endowments Department. Now, the Endowments Department takes over from individual families any temple that's generating a particular amount of money to keep them from absconding with offerings. And then they supervise the temple. In 1993, the Endowments Department, hereafter I'll just call it the Endowments, ejected the Madras family from the temple, Gangama's temple, specifically the women who had been serving her for 3 generations. The matriarch whom we had met serving the goddess in 1992 was heartbroken, no longer having intimate access to the goddess, bathing, dressing, and feeding her. The endowments brought in Brahmin male priests who initially had little knowledge of or a personal relationship with the goddess. They didn't know her story. They served in the temple only as employees of the endowments, most of them moving from temple to temple every few months. They didn't know the goddess's preference of color or what kind of sari she liked to wear. The temple flowers told me that during the first festival after the endowments had taken over and Brahmin male priests were decorating her, many festival celebrants complained that they were making her look like a Bollywood movie star, and she wasn't happy. There was some public agitation to bring back the matriarch who had been ejected, and she did come back the next year to decorate and serve Ganga during her festival. But thereafter, she never stepped foot into the temple. Once the endowments took over the daily caretaking, the pace of architectural changes picked up rather dramatically. Building of a roofed pavilion outside the original temple and compound walls around the exterior courtyard. Then a few years later, the endowments added a tall gopuram, or temple gateway, and added cast cement or sculpted brightly painted images of Puranic or Sanskritic deities around the top of the temple pavilion. I think you can see it. There, yeah. Note that this year the temple was painted in bright colors rather than white. These Brahminic ritual and architectural changes have changed many worshippers' perceptions of Ganga, now fully enclosed, several times enclosed, and unable to wander. She seems to have lost some of her powerful, fearful edge. She's being domesticated, what religious studies scholar Joanne Waghorn calls a process of gentrification. However, the process isn't totally complete. Animal sacrifice is still offered in the outer courtyard, out of sight of the Brahmin priests, actually out of sight of the goddess herself. The popularity of her festival has only grown, in part because of the fascination of men dressing as women during the festival, as part of a vow made to Ganga. But many of the new celebrants have no idea who this goddess is, her stories, her powerful demands, or her unique protective powers. Ganga had her own ideas about some of the changes that were made without her permission. Traditionally, for her annual festival, a neem tree had been cut down and placed in her temple courtyard, and saris wrapped around it, and the goddess was invited to inhabit that form. This was her first festival form, stepping out of the temple to make herself accessible to festival celebrants. However, the endowments, businesslike that they were, thought it was inefficient to cut down a new tree every year, and they erected a permanent cement pillar to take its place. And the temporary goddess form now being held in cement. So they perform this ritual of pouring various liquids over it and then wrap it in saris. You can see here the transformation from tree to cement pillar doesn't seem to bother the celebrants at all. However, it bothered the goddess. A week before the festival was to start, the first year the cement pillar had been built, Gangama knocked on Pujadama's door. Pujadama, whom we met earlier in the talk, narrated the visit. "Who's knocking on my door?" she said. And I thought, who's knocking on the door? I thought, and I opened the door. And she said, "Follow me." And we went to the temple, and she said, "From the beginning of time, from age to age, they used to satisfy me with a neem tree. Now it's like an office job, one of convenience rather than devotion. They brought this without asking me. They brought the stone pillar and placed it here. If they bring this stone, then what significance do I and my tridents have?" Tridents being another traditional form. Gangama told Pujadama to take all the tridents and keep them at her home. Pujadama reminded her that there's no space for her in these small rental rooms she permits. Gangama concurred and threw out all the tridents herself. Pujadama concluded the narrative by saying that the goddess, quote, pouted and took away all the tridents. She went away from the temple, cursing those who brought in the cement pillar. "Let them get some unknown disease," she said. Since then, Pujadama no longer visits the temple. For her, Gangama is no longer there. Quote, "She won't stay there. She went off towards the hills." This is a rather astonishing statement, that the temple and thereby the goddess herself have been so radically changed that Gangama is no longer recognizable, perhaps even to herself, and she refuses to live there. We shift now briefly to the South Indian city of Hyderabad, where Grama Devata shrines regularly punctuate the lanes and streets. Many of them are experiencing similar architectural transformations that begin with a literal effort to keep rapid urban expansion from encroaching on the land. On the land that the goddesses inhabit, and to quite literally protect them from Hyderabad's crazy traffic. building boundary walls with smaller or lower or larger enclosures. You can see here under the tree there is a Gramadevata temple, and that would traditionally have been at the edge of a village, or so you could actually, were you to do GIS mapping and all that, which I don't do, map out the development history of Hyderabad. Some external colorful paintings of Puranic deities have been motivated by devotion to beautify the goddess's home and make her comfortable. Like we live, explained one devotee. So there, sorry, the color's not good with all this light, but under the tree, there's a yellow painted shrine, and I'll just show you a few more. I love this one, right smack in the middle of a 4-lane highway. Again, the street's going around it, and there's a boundary wall. Oh, sorry, now let's just go back up. There you can see my yellow roofed one. Many shrines are so small they require a worshiper to bend down to see the interior goddess, which many worshipers do not take time to do in their busy commutes. So for many passers-by and those who stop to make brief salutation to whoever's inside, the visual identification of her is that of those painted on the outside. The Puranic deities Durga or Kali. That's Durga on a lion there. But this, what we may call misidentification, doesn't seem to bother the caretakers of the shrines. In fact, they may not even know unless I ask. Each shrine has its own narratives and spatial family and divine histories that are quite literally being built over and around through urban development. Let me describe one of these shrines, that of the Gramadevata Nalapochama. Sorry, let's just see the exterior and the interior goddess. This shrine has been taken over by endowments, the local neighborhood association, and its caretakers ejected, just like the Tirupati family was, and replaced by Brahmin priests. Pochama traditionally resides at the edges of and protects bodies of water, such as rivers, lakes, and water tanks. So it's said that there was a water tank on the other side of that back wall, where that yellow building is, that she used to protect. And a trace of this association with water sources remains at the bore well that sits at the entry. You can see the hand pump there. The shrine lies on the side of a long paved narrow road that connects the neighborhood interior to a main thoroughfare. The single doorway is flanked by images of the mustached, whip-wielding Potaraju. He is the single brother of the 7 sister Gramadevata, or village goddesses, and a red-saried woman holding a Gramadevata festival pot on her head with a snake on, not a snake, a flame on top. These images are cues that the goddess inside is a Gramadevata, and not quite the same as the Puranic deities Durga and Kali painted on the 2 exterior walls. Although 2 large black stone plaques embedded in the courtyard identify the goddess as Pochama, several worshippers, including the shrine caretaker's own 30-year-old MA graduate daughter, identified the interior goddess as Durga. And in fact, a wall tile of Durga sits above the small uncarved rock covered with vermilion and turmeric powders that is Pochama. I first met the female caretaker of Pochama's shrine in the fall of 2014. It was a day special to the goddess when she comes to clean the shrine's interior and reapply Pochama's turmeric covering. She wore a green sari and a turmeric-colored blouse. Colors, she said, were pleasing to the goddess, and an unusually large dark red forehead marking. Both arms were covered with a more than usual number of bangles that marked her auspiciousness, and her graying hair was loose rather than being tied up in a bun. Loose hair is required for possession, but remember, it's also matted loose hair associated with sexuality. All signs of a woman in a particularly close relationship with, often possession by, a Gramadevata. She began the performance of the story of her shrine. She said, We made all of this, all of this. In the beginning, the goddess came to me in my sleep. She told me to light her oil lamp, that is, to begin to worship her. And I said, okay, Amma. And she was a little girl. She said this in my sleep, to light an oil lamp for her. And then she said, everything will go well for you now, my dear child. And after that, we made all of this. The matriarch explained that she first dug a hole in the earth under a tree next to a big well and put in it bits of gold and silver, turmeric and vermilion, covered them up with soil, and then set up the tiny rock that became the goddess. After that, she continued, the goddess gave all these good things. Since establishing the shrine, the Potter caste family that has served Pochama on this site for several decades and gradually made improvements to the shrine. The matriarch explained that it was the neighborhood association that had told them they should wall in the shrine in its courtyard to protect it from traffic and land grabbing. But the association gave no money at all. She emphasized the family has paid for all the expansions with its own funds. I asked the matriarch about the relationship between the interior Pochama and the Puranic goddesses Durga and Kali painted on the exterior walls. Her answer, like many I received to similar questions, was that, quote, all goddesses are the same. But, she explained, those shrines had paintings on the outside just to make them look good. The real goddess was the tiny stone inside. However, like I said earlier, many middle-class passers-by whose family or caste do not traditionally participate in Grama Devata traditions do not know who's inside. On a brief visit to Hyderabad in the winter of 2015, I walked past a dramatically changing Pochama site. The old shrine had been demolished and a new temple was in mid-construction, and the transformation was complete by the time I returned in August. The goddess had been reinstalled as a full-bodied image with the tiny original stone sitting at her feet, looking rather neglected. She was flanked by two male deities, Ganesha and Murugan, the sons of Shiva and Parvati. She was being served by a rather surly Brahmin male priest and sung to in Sanskrit. When I met the temple president, he explained the neighborhood association had decided to take up renovation of the shrine so that, quote, it would be accessible to all in the neighborhood. Specifically, he meant, as a sign on the outer compound wall makes explicit, that all animal sacrifice required by Grama Devatas and offered to her by lower caste worshippers, and alcohol associated with Grama Devata's brother Potaraju would be forbidden, so that, quote, all castes would be able to come to the temple, i.e. those who object to animal sacrifice and alcohol. It was true, as I learned in speaking to many worshippers, that new temple was drawing new middle class and mid-caste clientele that had never worshipped at the earlier site. The temple president didn't seem to think, however, of who may be excluded by these prohibitions, including the Grama Devata goddess herself. Further, the temple president said they wanted to systematize the rituals offered to the goddess, meaning to introduce Brahminic rituals and Sanskrit chanting. When I asked why the two male brothers were installed next to her, suggesting their presence implied that the goddess in between was their mother, Parvati, he said, no, her name's the same, Pochama, but it's good to have them protect her. I was unable to locate the original Potter family who had served Pochama for so many years. They didn't come to the temple. They didn't answer their phones. Having witnessed a similar eviction of goddess caretakers in Tirupati, I can only imagine their keen sense of loss as the abode of the goddess they had tended so faithfully was demolished. They were evicted, and their goddess was radically transformed. Theologically speaking, I wonder if the goddess, too, experiences this loss as she's transformed into a very different persona, or if she's happy or satisfied with her rising caste and class status. The initial reason for making permanent and expanding tiny Grama Devata shrines is to physically protect the goddess. Secondarily, the forms of architecture and the paintings on the outside walls are to aesthetically please her, but the permanent enclosures and painted decoration are changing her identity to be more like Puranic goddesses, from powerful Grama Devatas who protect to goddesses who need protection, not only physical, but social protection. These changes are keeping Chanchal goddesses in place. So to conclude briefly, both Matamas and the Grama Devatas with whom they are in relationship are traditionally unmarried, arguably socially unconstrained by marriage. although they may have sexual relationships with men for the women and may have children for both women and goddesses. They are wandering chancho females who traverse both physical and social space. But chancho females belie middle-class gender norms, under which women are expected to get married and stay home, or, if professional working women, are expected not to linger in or traverse public space without reason. Not insignificantly, both these chancho females are lower caste, the goddesses traditionally served by low-caste caretakers. They are increasingly be held in place through marriage and or protection by males, and for the goddesses architecturally. Matamas thereby lose their unique identities, their ritual roles and power, and a social institution that has granted them both freedom and refuge. And the goddesses lose their fierce identities as boundary protectors and protectors from illnesses, becoming more and more like Puranic settled goddesses. As the Tirupati goddess wondered, now what significance do I have?
Yes, thank you very much. The floor is yours. Questions?
Gosh, I'm just going to get a pencil in case somebody says something. Now, don't notice when I write down. Go ahead, I can hear. Actually, let me just tell you one thing. I have a terrible cold, and one of my ears is slightly deaf. So please speak up.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm a student of anthropology, and I really enjoyed it. Few questions. How widespread is that phenomenon, historically and contemporarily?
The matamas?
Yes. Is it a dying phenomenon? That's what I kind of glean from your talk. And what can people like me who are not specialists in Indian traditions, what can we learn from that case study? What can we generalize from your research? And if you have time to talk about agency of materiality, I'll be very happy to.
Okay. You know, in Tirupati itself, the town where I worked, it's a big pilgrimage center, probably the second wealthiest religious institution in the world after the Vatican. It is dying, but it's hard to say to what extent because it's so underground. Like, I had been to Tirupati 4 times for the festival, so like for 2 weeks at a time. Then I lived there for a year. I'd been there 4 months before I ever heard of Matamas. And once I heard about them, so many things about this goddess began to make sense. So, but in this next state, there's a major temple to which women are dedicated. And it's still relatively common there, but because of this middle class pressure to abandon it, meaning to get married, I don't think it'll last more than another generation. I do just want to say, it's a terribly controversial thing to say, but, well, the first part's not controversial. That is, when you become educated in India, you become educated, even if it's not a religious education, into upper caste, middle class culture. So this is the controversial part. So I conclude, education is not all that great for women, for lower class and caste women, until they reach a particular point. But that, like that high school girl leaning against that doorway, I mean, she also wasn't working. She wasn't allowed to work in the field. She wasn't allowed to work on the road. But she wasn't doing anything else either. So actually, because she brought in no income, her value in that house went down. So I've seen a lot of women in that mid-level education really get caught. They're neither here nor there. They neither get the benefits of being totally non-educated, low caste, low class, where they have quite freedom to move, or the benefits of becoming very educated. Okay, so I think education is what's changing it, not the law. Now, so what to someone like you? I think it's, you know, just to be, well, there are a couple things. To be aware of the variation in any given culture, and of course, as an anthropologist, you know this, but, right, so many people think of India as Brahminic and Sanskritic and upper caste and vegetarian, and it's just not true. And so, you know, one reason I do this work is actually to add to the archive, that these people's voices will count. 100 years from now, you know, there may not be very many traces, but they were there once. They had agency. Might be, you know, the materiality of, the agency of materiality might be more interesting to you. Although, to me, the gendered piece is interesting. So this is just one chapter, the architecture piece. I have 5 forms of materiality. So I start with ornaments, which all Indians, you can never say that. Most Indians with 10 adjectives would say are agentive, like gold changes a woman. Tattoos change a person. So I start with that, and then also guising, which is too much to explain right here. Changing a person. Well, you guys all do Purim. You know it changes you. We do Halloween. People don't think it does, but anyhow. And then so the indigenously, where does it count that materiality has agency? And then I move to where they may not think it has agency. So what I'm interested in the architecture is that while people may do it for one reason, protect the goddess from traffic, or make her happy that she should be enclosed from the hot season or the rain, it's actually doing something else that wasn't part of their intention. So in that sense, is agentive. Mm-hmm.
I think I can see here 2 processes. One, I think that is a process of cities taking over rural areas. So this urbanization of rural areas where things that were parts of villages are now in the middle of towns. There's a lot of traffic. Things are changing. I can see a process of sort of a spreading, as you describe it, of the middle class state of mind. So it's the bourgeoisization of Indian society to some extent. So as you said, it's this combination of class, education, and culture and politics. But there seems to be a deeper problem. In every culture, there are roles allocated for the so-called downtrodden, for the marginal. And this seems to be one of those cults. It is not an important cult. It is a marginal cult. It is not mainstream. It is out there in the gray zone. But it's very important for every culture to have something like that. So women like that, who are sort of weak, in many ways, are given certain liberties that they would not be given otherwise. Now, my experience is that you can't simply block that there's always a process of exchanging one form of marginality with another. If you're looking at Western culture, you can get rid of paganism, sure, but the cult of the saints in many ways is a substitute. Now, what you seem to describe is simply a phenomenon disappearing. Where do these energies go? I mean, they must go somewhere.
That's a really good question, obviously. First of all, you know, I don't know if any of you had time to read the article that I sent, but that woman, there's a whole class of women that aren't Matamas, but fill this kind of ritual relationship with the goddess who protects them. So, like the woman of the Pochama, that one in the green sari, right? She looked like a Matama with her loose hair, her big forehead marking, and she had ritual power. So when the Brahmin men take over, or it's declared illegal, where does that energy go? First of all, while Mahtamas themselves may be a minority tradition, low-class women are not, and low-caste women. So, I mean, it is a, cultish, I suppose, and is a space for them. But, plenty of people don't become Mahtamas who also serve this goddess. So what's happening to them now that they become educated and they think they shouldn't become possessed? Possession happens to basically plenty of exceptions, non-educated, lower caste women. So that's also being lost.
There's still lots of uneducated, low caste women.
That's right.
What do they do? Is this gone?
Well, they're getting possessed.
Are they still getting possessed?
That's right.
But not as Mahtamas?
But not as Mahtamas, that's right. So the goddess can still come to people and possess people without this relationship. This relationship really had to do with illness.
But how does it affect their lives? Are they still allowed to be chanchas, to move from place to place, to do things? Because this seems to me as one of the main advantages of Mahtamas.
Yeah.
I mean, a respectable woman cannot do this, but a Mahtama can.
That's right.
All right.
So lower class women can still move because they work in the fields. Almost all the road work is done by women. Most of the rice is planted by women. So lower class women and lower caste also move a lot still. But it's education that's going to keep them from moving. Now, where do they go once they become educated? What do they do with that energy? I don't really know. I mean, I think, the culture is becoming more patriarchal with education, not less.
Strange, isn't it?
Yeah. So, maybe you have to get your PhD and then you can be Chanchal again. I mean, I think it's on the other end of it. It's the women that are caught in this 10th grade, 12th grade.
So only upper class women are allowed to be free. This liberty is lost for lower class women. That's it. This is what you're saying.
For middle class women, it's lost.
Well, so
Yeah,
middle class.
yeah, I am saying that. So even today, I mean, help me out here, Mikhail.
Yeah, I think even in North India, because you're speaking about South India, I think even when I came to my field and I was alone physically and walking around the peripheries of Delhi, people thought I'm crazy. Like something is wrong with me. Maybe I need a protection. Maybe I need to stay with them. Like they were trying to find solution for how I can be in this space without keep moving from one neighborhood to another and keep coming and going. But it's okay. Jewish people also that met me in India try to do the same, figure out how they can keep me safe. So maybe it's not only India, but definitely I think we can also, maybe you can connect it to a pan-Indian political discourse of the right wing, which is in a way, and also around violence, because women are much more exposed to violence. Like in Punjab, it's known that women who works in the field, lower caste, their chance of getting raped or being, experience physical threats upon themselves is much higher than women who are at home. And then there is this full discussion.
I wanted to keep it from becoming part of sexual violence because in the South it doesn't feel like that. That is the tradition itself. But the right-wing part, India was considered Mother India, and she needed to be protected, that land itself, from the British. And how did we protect her? It was through our women. Our women were going to maintain our traditions. What does our traditions mean? It means upper caste traditions. That's what it meant. So in that sense...
There's a new sort of Hindu orthodoxy now, which is being imposed on...
Yeah, I think the class piece started before the right-wing piece started. I can give you an example. In the village, my home village, so I was raised in India, and I walked a lot. I was really chanchal. But I guess because of my white skin, everybody just rolled their eyebrows and said, okay. But when I go to my home village, I stay with a, 10th grade teacher, single woman. And my village is about 2,000 people, max, if even. Once a week, there's a bazaar or a farmer's market at the other side of the village. It can't take us more than 12 minutes to walk there. She never goes when I'm not there. Ever, ever, ever. And I said, oh my God, like, really? And she said, oh, it's not good for madam, which means not what it means in English, if, a school teacher, to be seen out like that. I mean, it's astounding to me.
Because it's dangerous?
No, it's just out in public. What are you doing out in public, walking across the village, down the major road? It's astounding to me. So, what has she done with that energy that her mother would have had no problem? Her mother used to work in the fields, was tattooed, was totally non-educated, free as a bird. So what does my friend do with that energy? That's what you're asking. Where does that go? I don't know.
But do they, okay, sorry, I've just continued with this thought, because like in the cities, for example, sometimes there is reorganization of religion, even between lower classes. So they find their own association, their own place to sing to the gods, their own place to celebrate and get possession. Does it also happen in the same way, if I continue your idea of change, like something was appropriated, taken from them, so they shift to another zone of, like a community, maybe they create their own space for sharing their devotion?
Yeah, middle-class women get together for sure and sing. But, it's in their apartment buildings, or it's their relatives, or, they're not crossing clear across town. Although, if you have a religious reason to go out, maybe some do. But I think women are, there's a wonderful organization. This has nothing to do with anything, except I have a footnote to tell you. In Pakistan, called Girls at Dhabbas. So dhabbas are like coffee shops, like open-air coffee shops or tea stalls. And they are male space. Women do not sit in dhabbas. You die to, right? It's the best tea in the world, chai. So these women are like, they're the young women who've started a movement, Girls at Dhabbas. Like, we have a right to public space. It's an awesome organization.
So is there the Kiss of Love? I think a couple of years ago, there was also a movement about women expressing physical affection in a public space. Again, as part of that effort, right? Again, I think it was I don't remember if it was in South India or elsewhere, but I remember it coincided with a course I taught that dealt with the confinement of women to non-public spaces, and sort of how in classical literature a woman cannot be in these spaces, and the only thing that she has to protect her, if she is in such cases, is her chastity, her loyalty to a husband. Then she's allowed to invoke some kind of power that can make these dangers go away. So right around the time that we were talking about that, there was a movement called, I think, the Kiss of Love. And it's similar to what you're talking about in Pakistan. Women sort of trying to reclaim the public space. So it's happening, but...
Yeah, maybe that's what's happening. It's when they get educated enough, they're reclaiming it. But this mid-level...
We have an expert here on coffee houses in Cairo, the Muslim world.
Which one of you nodding your head? Hi.
Yeah, well, there seems to be some similarities, at least with the role. Where can women go and what can they do when they're there? So they start as prostitutes, and then they entertainers, and then as full clients and patrons.
Right, but that's a moment of change that's coming in late in the 19th century, and more so during the 20th century, when women are reclaiming that space, and that also is connected to the kind of European women under the umbrella of colonialism or European migration to Egypt, and it engenders criticism from the Muslim middle class, and they're considered as prostitutes. Muslim women who go out into public spaces and into establishments that are coffee shops or associated with coffee shops takes into the middle of the 20th century to make it more acceptable, the presence of women in coffee shop, and even then, even today, in a very limited way. If we're talking about earlier times, let's say mid-19th century and even earlier, so yes, basically coffee shops are male spaces, although I have like some corrections to that generalization. But what is interesting to me is that there's a kind of a relational aspect to that male spaces, to the male space of the coffee shop with surrounding spaces in the urban matrix. So men are sitting in a coffee shop, but women are passing by. And there's like a male gaze upon the women who are passing by in the streets freely. So there's this kind of a relationship there that I'm trying to figure out the implications of.
Interesting.
Elia wanted to ask something.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, because we're talking about private space and public space, and I was wondering if the concept of chanchang, I don't know if I'm saying it
Chanchel?
is it something that the concept of neighborhood relevant to it? If a woman is around her neighborhood, would it still be, she would still be conceived as chanchang if she moves around that near close region to her house?
Yeah.
If it's relevant in any case, and like the example you gave about your teacher in the village, you said she won't leave the village to the other end, to the market, but she still walks around the village.
She goes to the school and back.
Okay, so for that, it's okay, that's not making it.
Actually, to tell you the truth, every morning she walks out to the fields when I'm there. And that's okay because no one sees her. But as long as you have a destination, and I don't understand why the bazaar isn't a destination. That's what I don't understand. But, I think she's really asserting her middle class because she's not middle class, right? She's her parents were really poor land laborers, and now she's made the transition. So she's overperforming class. But she could walk around within a few. It kind of, if you have a destination, you're allowed to go. When I did my field work, we didn't have indoor latrines. My PhD field work. And so we'd have to go to the fields, and it was amazing. Women would start like at 4. You couldn't actually sit and do your thing until after sunset. But they'd start like at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you could stop on the way and chit and chat, but you had a destination. Once indoor latrines started being installed, that movement was stopped. It wasn't particularly good for women. Okay, latrines, education, because it kept them at home. Then,
Nina?
I would like
I'm going to come close because my ear is bad.
and
You can't.
cold also. I was wondering if you could elaborate. What you portrayed was actually a two-sided thing. The Matamas girls, their actual relationship with the goddess allows them a movement, while those particular goddesses are confined to a specific place and becoming more and more and more confined. And from my field, what I know of deities movement, which is the Greek cults, the movement comes usually from this diffusion of ritual, usually from apotrophic deities. deities that have specific protective sides, healing sides, and then the ritual moves from one place to another. So I was wondering if you've seen something similar there, of this diffusion, of this movement, not of the deity itself, but of the ritual. And also, if you could speak a little bit about this relationship of the Matamas girls to the deity. You spoke about exchange, about some sort of marital thing. Did you see sort of a similarity between the goddess and the Matamas? Do they, in some ways, incline to, do they diffuse into one another?
Okay, well, these goddesses are interesting in the sense that they are characterized as moving, but they're also very local. So they give identity to that village. So there are 7 sisters, all unmarried. And each village has a different listing of them. Maybe the first 2 or 3 will be the same, and then they go, amma, meaning goddess, goddess, goddess. So they're very local. It's not that they wander big distances outside of the terrain that they protect, but within that terrain, they wander. I don't know quite. So they're not going big distances. And I think it's, you know, it's not a coincidence that both the Matamas and the goddesses are being held in place at the same time. And I would say through middle class classicization of the culture. You know, if Matamas kept wandering, I mean, it's not tit for tat. It's not because this, then this, but both are happening at the same time, becoming enclosed, Brahmin male priests being brought in, and really that the uniqueness of those traditions being lost. The rituals themselves, I mean, the Matamas, when they say they're made to wander from hill to hill, I mean, I don't really know how far that is, right? But we can say, you know, like the Matama that took me around on this walking tour was astounding. We walked miles. So miles, but not 20 miles or 30 miles, or, I mean, if you're thinking actual distance. Because the next goddess is then in her territory, protecting those boundaries. Yeah.
Just to quickly jump into what I was saying and where I find our work really, and your lecture is very interesting to me, and thank you for that, is that coffee houses in Cairo were a male space, but they were also a lower class space, at least until the end of the 19th century. So what I suggest is that those coffee houses enabled classmen to replicate upper class social traditions of gender segregation of the urban space, but by inversion. What I learned from your lecture is that there was actually a very interesting inversion there, because it were the men who sat still in the coffee house, gazing at women dressing up.
Let me just say that there are totally modern coffee shops now that, you know, any of us can go sit anytime we want. But there's plenty of male gaze there too. But we're allowed.
We have here an expert on South America. This conflict, if you want, the domestication of local religion by Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors. And I was wondering if you could find similarities in your work in this attempt to look at, so to domesticate local cults, to make them different in some ways.
Just to be clear, like if you're looking from the indigenous perspective, because yes, of course, like especially if you think about like the cult of Mary, the cult of saints, and how they were adopted and assimilated into indigenous societies. So yes, there are similarities, although there is quite striking differences between South America and the colonial project, and now, including how, in retrospect, we understand like how historiography itself changing how we understand the kind of hybrid religion that developed in those parts.
What I would say one difference is that, first of all, Hindu upper caste is not that distinct from lower caste religion. They have their own goddesses, lower caste, but lower caste would still worship the upper caste if they can't worship them directly, right? There has to be a Brahmin priest. But they're not, it's a much more fluid, traditionally fluid system than Catholicism and shamanism, Peruvian shamanism, let's say.
Catholicism is much more flexible.
That's right. I don't know why there's a single Protestant in India, I just want to say. Because Catholicism is a little bit like Hinduism, just takes its arms, pulls in.
Everything
But it's, I think it's not nearly as distinct. So for example, if an upper caste baby gets chickenpox, they're not going to Durga for help. They're coming to this goddess.
Yes.
Yes.
I think that's true everywhere.
Yep. And so, you know, a lot of them will send like animal sacrifice because she requires it via the hand of their servants, right? So they're still participating in that tradition, even as they're trying to suppress it. So, you know, so far she hasn't lost her iconography. I mean, she's losing it though. Well, one village, they call her Pochama Lakshmi, one temple in Hyderabad. So I said, you know, what on earth? First of all, at least put her with Durga, who's not married and, you know, is on the side of her. And they said, well, so I said, what's the relationship? No. For 23 hours a day, she's Lakshmi, and for 1 hour a day, she's Pochama, when she wanders, specifically. So
I think that's very true of Christian cults of saints. I mean, you start as the local Diana, or the local Astragatis, or the local Venus, and then you become a specific type of Mary. You become Saint Tekla. You become, etc., etc. What I thought, I mean, we're running out of time, but just to mention, I don't know if you know the work of Bill Christian. So his work on local religion. So one of the interesting things I thought, that's why I started is, okay, so you have local religion and you have the center. The center is always trying to, in some ways, incorporate, reshape local religions, because local religions are never good enough. They're never orthodox enough. They're always slightly superstitious or even heretical to some extent. Okay, so you're trying to pull in. Now, incorporation always includes changing the center as well, because once you've swallowed something, it changes you too. First question, how does it change you? The other thing which I thought was very interesting in the work of Bill, is of Christian, is that he says, in some ways, though, people find a miraculous image of Mary in the fields, okay? The local priests are coming over and they're taking her to town, because that's where she belongs, not in some stupid field outside of the center, too far from the cathedral. But the image keeps going back to the fields, because it tells them this is a natural thing, this is not an urban thing. So I'm wondering if in some ways, as I started asking, how do you in some ways maintain all that sort of division between nature and culture, between up and down? Things don't simply disappear, they go somewhere. It's not just, I think you try to answer me in terms of you know, individual responses, but I think I'm not talking about individuals. Individuals have all kinds of ways. I'm talking about classes. How do classes deal with the fact that they've just been sort of denuded? Okay, they've just been robbed of something. Surely there are other ways. Haven't we learned all the times that, you know, you find other ways of...
Well, what I would say is what they're getting, let's say Matamas, their children, they're losing ritual auspicious status. They're gaining economic status. That's what they're gaining. They're gaining economic stability. So let's say my friend who won't walk across the town, across the village.
They no longer need charisma? That's it?
Well, I mean, there are plenty of thousands of people living middle-class lives. They found a different charisma. I think, middle-class deities are also changing. There's a colleague of mine, Tulsi Srinivas, who has written The Cow in the Elevator. And it's about new ways of kind of wonder that middle class is creating now, because they need change too. They need spark. They need lack of stability, astonishment. And so I think gurus are taking that place also, where there's lots of miracle working, there's charisma. Middle class Hinduism is much more guru-oriented. Low class are not guru-oriented at all, I can say. Okay, as much as we can say. So I think gurus, and I think, economic stability is worth a lot. You're willing to give up a lot to have a home over your head. So.
If I just may say, we might know the answer in a couple of years, because what Joyce is actually describing is something that we can find already in the history of India. What we call Hinduism has the tendency, and there wasn't a middle class as such maybe 200 or 300 years ago, but there was a tendency of the upper caste to what we call to swallow. If you can't beat them, swallow them. And this is a tendency that goes
so is the upper class changing?
Hindu tradition long back, and it is, you mentioned smallpox. And there are goddesses, not just in South India, but in North India, who are actually assimilated to the Sanskrit tradition in the text. We find it in the text. In the text. And we know, it's almost treason today, that there has been, still they have some temples in rural areas, and they were swallowed into the Sanskritic tradition. Right. But still you find other traditions coming. So what I'm answering, maybe what happens now, what are the means to maintain this balance of marginal religious and social practices and beliefs in 100 years? We'll see the outcome. But certainly you can see that it is swallowed and then something else comes. And it's swallowed and something else comes. So maybe you ask in 100 years.
I'll be happy to come again.
That's
you
right.
will. From our point of view, you will.
Reborn as a fish, yes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.